I've decided to use the theme, where do you go from here, chaos or community? And I've deliberately chosen that to help me keep in my heart and head Martin Luther King Jr., the struggle and the movement, the campaigns and the movement of the 50s and 60s. I try to insist that there's an intensified number of years that must be observed, 1953 to 1973. A 20-year period. It needed to go on for another 20 years, minimally. It did not. And to remember also in this lecture this evening, the millions of people of this country whose names are not in any of the books. A few people who were assassinated are in the books. But there were over 110 martyrs of the struggle in the years 53 to 73. And that group includes only the people who, in the midst of campaigns in different parts of the South, were killed primarily because of their participation in some fashion. What is not in the books are the black folk who were not engaged in the struggle, but whose bodies were found in rivers in Alabama and Mississippi and elsewhere. Cold cases in many instances, murders that have never been solved, but that represented the terror, the violence, the underbelly of American society that we continue to want to ignore. So where do we go from here? Chaos or community? That, of course, some of you will know is the final, not the final, but the next to last book published by King. And it was not just the title of a book. It represented conversations and engagement in the struggle in the South. It represented the considered opinion and judgment of a fair variety of people who were intellectually involved as well as spiritually, morally, and physically engaged. And I contend that it is probably the singularly most significant question that comes out of that which is called the civil rights movement. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And you can already frame your own responses to that question. The movement was about far more than civil rights. And those of us who were pastors doing much of the struggle saw our work not as civil rights work, but as the absolutely demanded work of the gospel of Jesus. You need to understand that because that's a message that Christianity in the United States has largely neglected and ignored. That movement in the stretches of period, in the stretches of time that I've delineated, represents one of the most extraordinary adventures of a people in the history of the earth. Not just to insist that it was indeed more than a second American Revolution. It was indeed more than the issues that we sought to address, and more than even the direct action that we used. It was a movement that can be said to be an offer, an invitation of redemption to our society, to our country, and a prophetic word to Western civilization. And I saw Martin King, as the Moses that the United States needed, or even as a Jesus figure, perhaps the second coming of Jesus, or the third coming, or the 100th coming that was a sign that the nation dared in its foolishness to ignore. A liberating moment for our history. A prophet raised by God, but more, I think, significant than that, a prophet chosen by a movement, by a people. To think of the years that I'm describing, one must think of the fact that with a bus boycott on December the 5th, 1955, gathering in the afternoon to celebrate the effectiveness of that first day, 100 or more civic, religious, business, sorority, fraternal, university people gathered at the Holt Street Baptist Church. All of them sensing that they did it one day, they had to do it the second day, and so forth and so on. So organized a structure to direct the boycott, intuitively understanding that none of the structures they had in the community were adequate for the moment, for the time. And a half dozen people had talked and thought about it. And Martin King, representing that group of civic folk, was nominated to be president. The people, a movement. Black folks stayed off the buses in the numbers of 40 to 50,000 people. Young people walked that day rather than to ride the bus. The young, the elderly, the religious, the non-religious were so unified by the preparations done by people like Mary Jo Robinson and Rosa Parks and Vera Carr and a host of others, that they not only did it, but they said we have to do it again and again and again. And they did it for 381 days. Now, I'm laying that before you because I want you to see this movement as larger than what I or anyone else has been able to fully comprehend and describe. I'm working on an outline to assist in the understanding of the struggle, because it's unknown, it's not there. And so many people, even the academics, and I've read many of the books and I continue to read them, miss the essential character of that struggle. So where do we go from here, chaos or community? Let me quickly use one illustration of why this is a living legacy, why the past is infused in the very present moment in 2011. A few days ago, you will all remember that there were 2 obituaries announced in the same day in the newspaper. Fred Shuttlesworth and Steve Jobs. In the Los Angeles Times, the middle section of the paper, which is called the LA Extra, had a front page picture on that second section of Steve Jobs. In the middle had a picture also on the first page. Had a small bleep on this second section front page of a picture of Fred. On the inside of that paper, there were 4.5 full pages of photographs and narrative of Steve Jobs. There was a half page, 2 pages back, on Fred Shuttlesworth. Of course, Steve Jobs died leaving the Apple Corporation, other corporations, but also with an estate of $8 billion. He died as a kind of a wizard of technology. It's not yet certain whether that technology is blessing us or laying the framework for cursing us as a people. It obviously has been an extraordinary money-making device for all sorts of people. Fred Shuttlesworth, on the other side of the coin, was a Baptist preacher who was absolutely convicted by the notion that, as Howard Thurman said, the gospel of Jesus is a survival kit for the people whose backs are up against the wall. I remember Fred because I met him in '58. Every time there was a bombing of Fred's house, or that he was beaten up, or he was bombing of his church, I went into Birmingham to visit with him and to give him the support from the Racial Justice Department of the NCC and from FOR and from Martin King. So I went in every year, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63. I was an advanced staff person in Birmingham for the SCLC campaign of 1963. So I came to love Fred. His simplicity of spirit, complicated by a variety of kinds of the complications that can pursue any of us and all of us. Simple, but he was a man who, when the NAACP was outlawed in Alabama, started a local group for the state, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Never got very large, but he knew that it had to be a vehicle out of the spirit of history that would do the job that had to be done in Birmingham. Fred Shuttlesworth, 1963, was indeed the 5th campaign of direct action, nonviolent direct action in the movement. One of the things we have to recognize is that the movement had at least a dozen different dimensions, none of which have been thoroughly explored or researched or understood. It has the dimension of the spiritual awakening, the spiritual, moral, political, consciousness raising of millions of people who did not know what happened to them, but saw Birmingham, saw the sit-in campaign of '60, saw the Freedom Ride of '61. Each of these movements making an impact, but helping the direct action, nonviolent spirit to emerge and to impact the nation. Those dimensions are well ignored. They are ignored at the peril of our society. Let me just quickly name another dimension. The NAACP is almost the only organization in the 30s that developed a strategy to change our land. They developed a legal strategy. They decided, we're going to see to it that the Constitution of the United States is going to be challenged in such a fashion that it becomes inclusive of all Americans. By the time they had finished, 75 or 80, no, the legal issues were not finished. The Constitution was declared by a Supreme Court almost each time with 9 votes to 0 on behalf of black people Hispanic people, and women. Even the criminal, the Supreme Court announced in 1972, must have certain God-given rights that the governments must observe and recognize. Astonishing. That should be a cause for celebration in the nation. It never has been. No wonder you can have a federalist society. No wonder you can have this almost senseless notion that we're going to do the original intent of the Constitution. Not knowing our history. And the fact that it's something of a miracle that we have a Bill of Rights and a Declaration of Independence and a preamble to the Constitution and a Constitution that fundamentally suggests that we human beings can govern ourselves. But there has to be structures and processes and orders by which that self-government takes place. But it was excluded of necessity, so many people. The Constitution still has major decisions that insist it is for all of us and not just for the rich or for a few of us. In any case, Fred Shuttlesworth was a part of the nonviolent direct action dimension of the movement that basically called the nation to repentance and helped the nation to become a people more aware of one another, and more aware not only from whence we have come, but how much further we have to go. Let me describe it in this way. Here we are sitting at Boston University. In 1960, Boston had signs in windows of restaurants and lunch counters that said, "No dirty Irish allowed in here. No WAP. No Jew." The country was inundated with such signs in almost every state. These signs were there by custom, because of spiritual toxics that people ingested. They were also there in some places by virtue of laws that were crude laws for people that said we're going to be democratic, we're going to have self-governance. But they were there. In California, no Jew sign. Outside of San Clemente, there were signs that said, "No Negro should allow the sun to set on them in San Clemente, California." There was a second sign in San Clemente that said, "No Jew should allow themselves the sun to set on them here." No Indians, no Chinks, no Japs, no Mexicans. In some places there were no Catholic signs. It was a spiritual poison across the United States, and the religious groups never challenged them anywhere. And the challenge began in Nashville, in fact, in the Nashville campaign that began the process of the signs coming down. In 1964, the Civil Rights Bill that was passed made such signs unconstitutional. There may still be such a sign in some area, no Indian sign maybe in South Dakota or North Dakota, but basically such signs that I think, a shame upon the character of this people, America. Those signs generally came down. The point I would make about the movement is that this struggle helped to cause our nation to become a better nation in so many different ways. It helped all of us to adopt a sense of hospitality that is still largely present in the United States. Now, there are all sorts of problems with it. Joe Fagan a sociologist from Texas A&M who has spent the last 10 or 15 years doing fundamental research on racism, has suggested that while a majority of white people have said that racism must go, that a sizable percentage of white people continue to use even the language of racism in their private places, in their private parties. So there's a large piece of work yet to do. But fundamentally, the nation began to change. The change is not yet complete. We have done much, but it must be done over and over again. But the values of our land are values that stress wealth and power and male domination, that stress the successes of a Steve Jobs, but largely forgets that if our nation has a spiritual dimension of hospitality across the land, it is the Fred Shuttlesworths, the movement that we call the Civil Rights Movement, that began to make that happen.